Like to congratulate our colloquium organizers. We're here to talk about those very real attempts to siege our civilization. I would like to thank you for the invitation. Vilma Ortega, Jorge Volpic, when I was invited to moderate, I was given the place I wanted because I can share different points of view. Morning, I came from Santa Barbara, from LA, that yesterday at noon I took a bus after having a conversation with my students. Most of them are dreamers, and since November the 9th, they have come together. They're Salvadorans, they're Nicaraguans, they're Americans. I have a student from Syria and Macedonia. And we're bound together by our culture. We're Mexicans, and Mexicans are inclusive. I'm very grateful for this invitation, I should say. And some days ago in Santa Barbara, California, we celebrated the Congress 21 Day, an international congress, and the title was Nepantla, between Comala and California and other destinations. And as we are in Nepantla, God, we are in Nepantla. We are here. We have the essence of being in Nepantla and here between different rivers. So I bring special greetings from the University of California campus in Santa Barbara. As a Hispanic servant institution, and its president and the dean of the university have declared as in defense of undocumented students that live in uncertainty. They're a sanctuary university. So thank you very much. Let me introduce our panelists. They don't need an introduction because they're the best of the best in their field. So what the excellent organization of this event has given me with Emiliano Monjesi, and this very succinct line said, a polital, the winner of the Ibero-American Prize from Elena Poniatowska in 2016, and the book, The Scorched Land, and it has published the titles Arrastrar esa sombra from 28 and Morirse de memoria and Cielo árido. On my have, and I like the works of Emiliano Monge. I know what you've written for Letras Libres. I remember the Radio Ortuño that touches on the topic of this panel, narrations and testimonies of migration. In this third session, you talked about that line, the queue of Central American migrants, and with a very critical attitude back then, Emiliano Monge said, the ethics of doing what it's possible until it's possible. That's a very strong criticism to this phrase. I'm not saying a thing in what you said that it's an onslaught. But you also described migrations as a tragedy. So we should question this qualifier. Is it a tragedy or what is it? In his text from 2005, and I like the title, Blame the Smugglers or the Smuggled. And we congratulate you for your latest book, well, the most recent book, La Superficie Más Honda, in 2007, and it was a very nice read. Elmer Mendoza made a review before it was published. So once again, thank you. And I'm very glad to have this panel about narrations and testimony of migration. Emiliano, you have the floor.
Thank you. Before anything else, thank you for your introductory remarks. I want to thank the organizers. I'm truly happy to be here, very thrilled to be sharing the space with everyone, particularly with Father Sola Linde, who's done such important work, one of the few lights in a country like ours right now. Let me read a text that has to do with narrating migration, which is the generic topic of this panel. Sometimes I read very fast, so please feel free to stop me, to tell me to slow down. Pull the rein on me. Beyond walls, in the impossible distance, far from the cities, from the state cities or the modern states there will be the barbarians. They're not limited to the idea of a single god, the barbarians. It's the same if their women share the same social roles as their men. They're the barbarians. It's the same for those barbarians to sing, dance, and to paint or talk about fictions. They're the barbarians. They were, they are, they will be barbarians because that's what they will be. They will be others because they were, and they are going to be different, enigmatic, and very dangerous because they haven't been the civilized people who live inside the walls. This concretion of sticks, rocks, bricks, cement, hydraulic, concrete, protecting those that live inside and rejecting those that live outside the wall. Walls that are closed, fences, holes, mined fields, and postmodern walls. Aside from the materialization of fear, hatred, and prejudice of those beings that want to live, just barely realizing they are closed in, all these constructions are and will be the negation of the human being and the super us that makes everyone angry, those people that are called themselves civilized. And then the distance is not only shrinking and limiting and contaminating this barrier between us and the others, regardless of the barrier. Let us not remember that borders were are and will be symbolic, significant, and mental. Let us think about social classes, equality between men and women, with the distinctions we have seen, the color of the skin, the empire of that which is the same, which is equal, that leads historically, inevitably, to fascisms. How else can we explain this if not the essence of ultra-right movements throughout the world? How can we understand this if not through the arrival in power like individuals like Trump, who are phlegmatic and that are repugnant and disgusting vis-a-vis authority, vis-a-vis anything that is not like them, that is not the image that they see in the mirror. The empire of that which is equal has infected democracy from within. That's why today democracy seems to be suffering a self-immune disease, a malaise through which the system attacks itself, a pain that can be venereous and that which is nefarious as well. And first manifestation of this was the festivity of the borders, and the last expression, as Byung-Chul Han has said, the most important Korean philosopher of our time, social networks. This tool that had to overflow borders ended up being its best reproducer. Today, instead of seeking, and having a dialogue with that who is different, people are looking for people who think the same, who dress the same, who listen to the same music, who read, who laugh over the same joke. That one, then before any other one, is the other one, but it's also myself. The biggest danger of the conversion of the other and the other one and myself is that walls that are physical or symbolic are not necessary anymore, because the person that's different from me, more than a danger or enigmatic figure, it's an invisible being. And this has to do with something inside and outside the borders. Barbarians, we were sieging the palace, but we have participated in the most intelligent game, the best designed game, the most perverse game of those who call themselves civilized power, just like they've created ghettos. White men only believing in white, only looking for white men with their heads shaved, and before talking about the brown, the yellow, or the black, they say none of them are real. They're barbarians. We, the barbarians, have created our own people. Mexican academic middle class is looking for another Mexican middle class academic as well, from Salvador, from Argentina, an Indian who reads things and believes in the same things to form this herd. And because I don't want anyone that's not like me is non-existent. Like Enrique Diaz says in the book Traslado, the era of these men and women who are trained to see that which is happening, or that they want to happen, that they need to identify themselves to establish this relationship, but they cannot see what is happening just a few meters away from them. And even worse than that, they don't know how to identify with that which is happening. The other one, which is not the other one, oneself, is not only invisible, it's no one, nothing, never. And that other one, I insist, is not even beyond the fence, the hole, the wall, the trenches, the Frank zone. This other person, which is not other, it's myself, it's a brother, a neighbor, co-worker, someone, a pedestrian. We are clashing with the women from which we buy our vegetables without even saying anything. Our children going to school and we don't even recognize them. The migrant that we run into because we didn't even see him because it wasn't true that this migrant was there. No one was there. We just barely noticed that he was there. It wasn't true that this migrant was there. No one was there. How else, if it's not through looking at the other, ourselves, and the definitive decision of this otherness, how can we explain this the same way we should do with ultra rights and characters like Trump? This collectivity tragedy like the one lived by migrants, although there's no border between the first and the so-called third world where nothing is happening. Right now, everything is happening while I'm reading these words, while you're listening to my words, a humanitarian tragedy. This tragedy does not seem to be, but it has become invisible. No one, nothing, never. And six Senegalese, are they drowning, or the Philippine mothers are saying goodbye to their daughters that are going to be sold in Japan? And the Somalian families, are they going to the oil wells of the Emirates? And all these men will be exploited to the last breath. And the Salvadorians, the Hondurans, and the Guatemalans will also be exploited. All those boys and girls that are obligated to leave their countries before the gang takes them and eats them up, and also facing the possible Mexican rapists. Yes, because in spite of this invisibility that's become a real thing, and in spite of the fact that the civilized are imposing the rules on the barbarians, in spite of the empire of the which is equal and this short-sightedness. Many people are drowning. Many people are saying goodbye. While I'm reading here, many mothers are seeing their children disappear in this land called Mexico. While you're listening to everything I read, some boys, some girls is disappearing. The walls that were vertical constructions and then they were symbolic constructions have become territories now in the third world, especially in places where it touches the first world. The state nation has given place to the trench, which is also the nation. Democracy of this self-immune disease that I described with social conflict, this voluntary massive blindness that has taken me once and once more to the same point. The important thing is the way to cure our system, which is so sick of itself, and to return it the way our eyes can see, to give the other one his contour, his figure, his truth, and his existence, giving him also our own existence to any other person. We have to break away from the empire of equality so that we can live this for ourselves, that no one, nothing, never should be. All of us together, all of us always sharing with those that is not with us, to see ourselves in the mirrors that are returning that image that apparently is a deformed image. But in reality, it is making us complete instead of containing us and making us worse. The paths to do this are different. There are many paths, but they're all clear. They're all very complicated and very winding and long. We should each find our path. How are we going to live ourselves to understand the person next to us, the way in which we're going to recombine the idea of civilization and barbarism, to understand that over and beyond coincidences, we always have differences. Growing at the end is be part of the others. I myself is diluted in the singular. It's the plural that makes it assertive and gives it some sense. Now, which is my path? Empathy. I'm convinced that empathy, only through literature, paint, music, and laughter, is a way out that we have. It's the only door. Is no faster or better vehicle to live ourselves and experience the life of others, of another human being, than this. And this gives it a face to the Senegalese that's drowning, a history to the mother and the Philippine daughter that have just bid farewell, and a boy or girl running on the tracks of the train, trying not to be reached by the men after that's running after them, something closer than any of us. We're talking about a human tragedy, and this, I think, it's the key that will open the door. And this, I believe, this is the fence, the wall, or a postmodern wall. Finally, the Salvadorian kid will never be the same, running over the railroad tracks so that no one will grasp this boy, or after the Salvatrucha gang, this boy running from the Salvatrucha because they were sentenced to death, or this person runs just 30 meters away from the men after him, and step by step they are almost reaching him. They've eaten, they've been drinking. Not long ago, he, the last son of Carlos and Beatriz, with very thin legs, also with their very thin body, he hasn't eaten for 3 or 4 days now. He's just barely been able to drink a few drops of water. That's why his lips are dry, and that's why his eyes are sunken in his face. Oscar's breathing in the silence of the jungle. Right now, the sun is putting everyone to sleep, people that are not fleeing, and his breathing is increasingly hard, and the men are getting closer. The men that are after him are getting closer to him. Perhaps that's why Oscar thinks of stopping, of just collapsing on the floor, of just forgetting about everything else. Let me talk now about the possibilities, not only of fiction, but of the story of this narration. I myself, political scientist, a Mexican, 39 years old, and not circumcised, and I have promised never to go back to the dentist. I experience and I closely see the condition of a human being without any rights, not even to have the right to have the right, as written before through this story that Alexander, November at night after we were together 12 times and have smoked box cigarette, and after the Zetas attacked us, hundreds of pages of academic studies and essays, even journalistic articles that I read. While Alexander was describing his kidnapping, he was telling me about how the birds were singing and the men and women that were next to him, while he was describing obscurity, darkness, and the heat and the smell of the rooms where they were hid on their backs so that they would not escape, but that they could call their relatives in the United States. While he was telling me how he was all of a sudden putting up his sleeves of the son of a bitch that was after him, those $4,000 of his rescue, while he was telling me how he was being hit with a machete and the size of which he didn't even remember anymore. I was also kidnapped. I was also attacked. I was also harassed, and I knew that when I wrote his story, the machete would recover its size, someone else would be attacked, someone else would be kidnapped. Art and literature, more than conveying knowledge, they should be conveying experiences. A novel, performance, or a picture should refer to effectiveness, more to effectiveness than intelligence. Novelists and artists, we can deal with the same topics as sociologists, as political scientists and writers, but never with the same intention. As Julio Ramon Ribeiro said, novelists fail when they try to compete transmitting knowledge instead of knowing. They should be conveying experiences. This is what we should do: participate and invite to the festivity of life, but not giving recipes or a menu. That's why I insist, if anyone can catch the beast of the other and ourselves and our short-sightedness, if there's any type of medicine to cure democracies of self-immune diseases, if we can at any rate fight against borders and walls, it will be through art, music, and literature, capable of embodying in our experience all those other experiences that seemed alien to us, all those experiences that seemed to be things of barbarians. Thank you.
The best example of your proposal, it's yourself. You've made a performance right here, and you're giving us a verb, and that is to assess, and to have under siege. And in this 3 moments, you have described being under siege, and you're taking us to a very deep portion of our own narratives. And thank you very much for this artistic proposal, Emiliano. So this international colloquium, Civilization Under Siege, from wall to wall, would be remiss if we didn't have Father Solalinde, a fighter for human rights of migrants, the coordinator of the pastoral of peaceful mobility. He is the chair of the Hermanos en el Camino shelter, providing humanitarian aid to migrants and also orients the migrants from Central America and South America in their path towards the U.S. He has publicly condemned the abuses that happened against Latin American migrants, and he has been threatened in several occasions by criminal groups that profit from clandestine businesses that revolve around human trafficking, organs trafficking, and weapons trafficking. I would add a couple of lines, and I would be remiss if I don't share this with you about Pablo Solalinde. What's the name of Father Solalinde? Jose Alejandro Solalinde, Father Solalinde, a Sor Juana. He is part of the Carmelitas order, and I was expelled from the Carmelitas order. Yeah, I also read that you were expelled. Probably Sor Juana was expelled as well from the Carmelitas order, but he is a father. After prizes and being threatened, the National Prize Award for Human Rights in 5 years ago in December 2010. So you were in that golden cage. And for Garo Pardo, Emiliano Ruiz Parra wrote, oh, I'm sorry, I have Emiliano in my mind, Emiliano Ruiz Parra. And more than a review, describes with us a narrative of Father Solalinde's childhood. He is a migrant. And I don't know who's not a migrant here in this room, but for Father Solalinde, life is worth everything, and every life is a battle for life in Estepec, Oaxaca, in his shelter. He's a feminist. Father Solalinde is a journey in which he eliminates the roadblocks, and he sets the first stone, the biggest stone carved just like his beliefs. Father Solalinde knows the secret of God to the eyes of everyone, but no one wants to recognize the secret of life. Welcome, Father Solalinde. A big hand for Father Solalinde.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coinciding. I always say this because I believe that each one of us here today, you're all my family. There are no foreign people since Jesus of Nazareth said it, not the official version, but I'm talking about the Gospels. You are my family. I wanted to tell you that in 15 minutes it is very difficult to express very profound and deep thoughts, but I cannot be superficial. Even if it's just 15 minutes, but it'll be 15 minutes where I will try to communicate as much as I can the universe of conscience, something that I think might be of use to us. I conceive human beings as a whole, human beings as an entity, psychosocial, spiritual entity, not an isolated entity, always in a family. Impossible to see a person alone, isolated. We have to see it this way. We have to see the person this way, but also because of his time, this is a dynamic person that's ever changing, but this is a metamorphosis, a time of metamorphosis. I will not explain this. You understand it very well, but this being has been impacted by historic factors today and here. One of them, the strongest one, is the capitalist neoliberal system. We are immersed in it. We are in it as a second nature. It seems it's so normal to us. We're within it. We're inside it. This is a negative reference that might have some positive. We cannot demonize it, but yes, negative aspects that are sufficient so as to neglect it or not wanting to accept we're right in it. If there's a change of times, a transient civilization, yes, but we're also in different references, strong references and benchmarks, and the simple ones are no good. We truly have to look for transcendental references that help us go from this time of confusion, from this time of mobile identities, mutating identities to a personal identity, collective and human identity. We live in dehumanization. This is a humanism in crisis. Humanisms that we have are not enough as references to ensure the life we want to ensure. This is a very profound topic, migration as a main factor of global transformation. I want to share with you some intuitions, some inferences as of the testimonies, the observations, the testimonials, and the contemplation of so many migrant people. Throughout these years, I've been having the privilege for 13 years of working with those migrants. We've had many questions. I watched them, I observed them, I analyzed them from my humanistic perspective, but also the spiritual perspective. And I realized that they are the principal sign of our times. They are the ones that are letting us know about so many things that are to happen, things, and perhaps we do not know how to read them, things that are happening. And it's not only their world hasn't just been destroyed, the world we call the countries of origin, but that world is also our world. We cannot think anymore of a fragmented world, an isolated world. No, we live truly in the same planet, but we're also a system. What happens to one affects all of us. And I am certain, I am sure that this vision they gave us of the destruction of origin is a reflection of the destruction we have in our planet. But this transit from their country of origin to their destination that they believe they have, that they carry with them, makes them go through countries, in this case Mexico, but also speaking about Europe and the Mediterranean, mortal places that is costing them their lives, as if there was a law registered, inscribed in this migrant collective. They tend to go north, and there's the geopolitical direction. Many of them end up just in the way, but others are arriving at a very high cost, and they're talking about what is happening in the transit place, what is happening in the transit place, a place that makes us naked, like a territory of selfishness, of blindness, in which they are themselves and we are us, in which their problems are their problems, but we don't really understand that they're also our problems. So then, this means we have to look for a reference for us to change our vision. This is our obligation. They, before anything else, have this heritage which is negative, and we couldn't expect less from people who've received so little. There's precarious situation at the school level. Their schooling is very precarious. There's an absence of life in peace. They've lived violence right from their origin, and they haven't really had the best opportunities, good food and education. They haven't had any of those things. They've had violence from origin. They have injuries and wounds and so many other terrible things. But there are also people who have great qualities. I'm referring to the group of migrants from Africa and from America. The first thing I see, and this is something that's going to save the world, is their faith. I don't want you to be confused. They have religions, they bring religions, but the important thing is not the religion, it's the faith. I can ask a group like I've been doing, raise your hand, please. Those that are evangelical Christians, raise your hand. Those that are Catholics, they raise their hand. Those that raise their hands are those those that don't have any religion, no belief whatsoever, and they raise their hand as well. But if I say raise your hand if you believe in God, everyone raises their hand. How do you conceive this God? I ask. Is the God for all of us, not a franchise God? It's a God for everyone, and He is with everyone. He is a moving God, not static. He's not an object of adoration, someone who accompanies, who guides. That's the God they see. And there's something that I believe faith is important because Europe has fallen into a stage of secularism, of religions, of substitutions of religions, but finally, this dimension is necessary, the dimension of faith. And something they also bring is the collective sense, the community sense, love for the family, value of people, respect for their land. Land not as a merchandise, but as a substance, a mother that gives life to some, but we have to take care of this land because others are following behind us. They've taught us that we're all migrants, men and women. All men and women are beggars. Doesn't really matter how we cover our indigence, our needs. We're existential migrants and also beggars. And they've taught us so many things. Why have so much if we're pilgrims? We walk and we're leaving things behind. Everything is left behind. This is what they're teaching me. They are teaching me to go back to God. They are teaching all of us to God, not the official God, not the franchise God, not the God of private religions, the God of all of us, changing the vision, going back to ourselves. And there cannot be humanism if we don't go back to ourselves. And ourselves is not me, it's all of us. It's not I, it's all of us. We have to understand that they are us. We are a family, an integral family, a global family. I really feel bad when I was listening to Emiliano Monge, how people like Donald Trump, but I could mention so many other names like Trumpism. They fully ignore what is happening with their brothers and sisters in other strata. This really got my attention. Allow me to tell you, when I was talking to Alfonso Romo in Monterrey, in the city of Monterrey, he invited me once to go to his house, and I started questioning Alfonso Romo about many things. And I told him, Poncho, what is it that you have learned now, now that you're with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the leftist politician? He says it's been quite a strong experience being with him in these visits and tours. He visits very poor people suffering so many injustices. I've been able to know a different world, and this is a very rich man telling me this. He says, I've been able to know, yes, good heart, yes, I've been helping people, yes, but I hadn't understood, he said, what so many people are going through, so much injustice, and so many people that are so poor. I believe that migrants help us have this sense of the fact that we're all a family. People who live to have, people who are money addicts like Trump, they will never understand what it means to be a human family. They will never understand the value of a migrant, those migrants that he rejects and disdains. So we don't know ourselves, we don't recognize ourselves. In each migrant, we have a highly valuable person, and they've taught us that all of us, men and women, are worth something, not because of what we have. We have nothing, but our worth is our being persons, human beings. So the proposal they're offering to us is to change, to go from a capitalist, fragmentary, stratified, unequal vision and excluding perspective to a vision of a culture of the family, a culture which is global. I know this is going to take a long time because we're still talking about them and us, up and down, and we need to intoxicate ourselves from capitalism to deconstruct, to construct a new vision. We have to construct. We have to re-educate ourselves. We have so many prejudices and false values instilled by us by capitalism, materialism, consumerism. We need new references, new axiologies to also generate new humanism. I do believe that migrant people are transiting towards new humanism. Unprecedented. We have never lived this type of humanism. If we would all do an exercise of reflection, and if we could see in the historic horizon, the only history of the only humankind, we would truly see that we've gone through very hard lessons from civilization to civilizations, from one strata to the other, from one stage to the other, but we've never had a synthesis vision of what we are, integrating ourselves as persons, as human beings. We've never known a time, an era that hasn't been built, constructed by men, by men. We masculine men, we've never known a civilization of women, but even a balanced civilization balanced by women. We've never heard of that. We've never known that. And that's why we're so close to migrants. We're going through a transition. Let me conclude this first part telling you that I do have a reference, I do have a benchmark, and that's Jesus. But that Jesus, I insist, that Jesus who is there in the Gospels, not the official Jesus. The official Jesus gives a little bit of everything, like a smorgasbord. He justifies everything, power, money can be justified. The anti-evangelical, the anti-gospel can be justified. But Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels, that young man is something else. I visited Europe a few days ago. I was there for 2 months, and people there are truly looking for spirituality, but they say they're agnostics, atheists, and I've shown to them that they're atheists of the official God because they haven't given themselves the opportunity of even reading the Gospels without prejudice, not like Catholicism, but as a meeting, a gathering with someone who's personal. And I tell you, this challenge we face, we can look for the references as we want. And I can tell you this openly as a priest, not as a church promoter or promoter of Catholicism. I'm not interested in doing that. I'm interested in something else. It's a valid reference with all the wealth, with all the richness of Jesus of Nazareth, everything he has. And this is what leads migrants, most of them from Latin America. That's what they have. For them, it's extremely important to have Jesus as their reference. Thank you.
Se cayó de pronto.
We wanted to hear you more, so you fell silent. Oh, but I was given 15 minutes, but yeah, for the second round, I can take more time if you want. Well, what I'm saying is very silly. Well, if I say that what you said is very important, but for us who work with different groups in a classroom, and all of a sudden a student asks, Professor, for God's sake, let me answer the phone to my father because he's a smuggler and he doesn't call me that often. And all the rest of the students were shocked. And when a student tells me, and that really hurt my heart, when he said, I'm from Guerrero. Well, my grandfather was part of the army, all of those who killed Lucio Cabañas, and I was paralyzed. Or when a student tells me, I'm going to write a thesis about the Mara gangs, and I'm part of a Mara gang. So it's very hard to open their doors, but being a dissident is not thinking like us. And ideologically, there is a clash between what we think that is ours and what you said, Father. Somehow we are on the path. I'm not saying that this is the right path, but we have to open up to different mindsets. Thank you very much, Father. And now we'll hear from the panelists in this group. Now we'll hear from Miriam Hassan, writer of Entre Otros, Migrantes Mexicanos and Política de Estados Unidos, published by Grantham University Press, an expert in U.S. Central American Mexican immigration policy. Dr. Hassan is a researcher and has taught at the Institute of Immigration Policies in Rutgers Penn University and the Tomas Rivera Institute from Texas University in Austin University in Texas. She has worked for different ties that unite Mexico and the U.S. I liked reading one of your writings. I knew about you, but I followed your steps, even if you're unaware of that. When you talk about migration and you place it into context historically, you describe immigration and how immigration changes. The election of 2016, the Trump effect when they were deportations before Trump, and those are very hurtful. When you talk about the votes of the minorities, the migrant, undocumented groups. I heard you say yesterday in an interview that it's all over YouTube. So I met you personally through YouTube because you were very clear in your ideas. And I liked it very much when Jorge Volpi, in his book in 2014, La Guerra y las Palabras, Una Historia Intelectual 1994, he thanks his friends, and you are amongst his friends. So welcome to this Congress, this international Congress that we call it different ways. This international colloquium, The Siege Upon Civilization from Wall to Wall. Welcome, Miriam. Thank you. Thank you very much for welcoming me, and I'm very glad to be back at UNAM. I studied at UNAM. I am a Puma supporter, so I'm very glad to give something back to the university where I studied. Father Solalinde, I liked what you said because I read Hannah Arendt recently, and she spoke about refugees, and the way we treat our refugees and migrants reflects the society we are. So I believe that this is a good start. I don't know if my presentation would have fit better in the previous panel, but my presentation is a paper that I wrote, but I hope that this is going to make my life easier. And I want to talk about reluctance to the demographics in the U.S. And our presentation is titled Continuum or hopelessness, but in general, I'm trying to describe what is going on. I would like to begin by questioning the title of this title, not because I want to sound controversial, but to talk about the siege upon civilization that we see all over means that there is some sort of civilization that it's being under siege, and at least in immigration. I would like to question this statement, but I don't think that there was already a civilization that all of a sudden Trump comes to siege upon. Or in Europe, the same case where liberal regimes last very shortly, most of them. So what do we mean by civilization? Do we mean the existence of a liberal state or an open society? I'm raising this question. Is the U.S., at least in immigration, has it been a liberal and an open society? And to me, it's not very clear. In that sense, that it's kind of my conclusion, and I'm going to tell you about it, I think that there is continuity. And probably we see that the U.S. has been has excluded many groups historically. And in that sense, I'm a politologist, therefore I would like to use political science and migration. And today there is an argument that advanced states are facing a liberal paradox. They have to choose in between having more migrants, but they're not granting rights as the Arab states do, or if they receive less migrants, but they grant them rights because immigrants are seen as a challenge and a threat to the welfare state, to the democratic values and security. For example, the rejection of Muslim migrants, considering that they don't share democratic values. That's the allegation. So should we base this debate between figures? I would say that there is no liberal paradox that might stand, because in immigration we're not talking about liberal states, and we can see it in history of the United States. Gary Gerstle mentioned it by analyzing the U.S. legislation, the reforms to immigration over time, more than creating an open state. U.S. history in that effort that we see reflected in the standards and in the laws, they've tried to create an ethnocentric state. The goal has been always been to create a white state. And yes, all Americans refer to the nation that they are a nation of migrants. But this is what we hear in the academia. Steve Solberg wrote the book Nación por Diseño, Nation by Design, and the U.S. is that. It's a nation that has been designed by whites. So if we mention some of the legislations that I would like to use as an example, so the persecution of migrants, it's not new. The Chinese people in the 19th century, they were persecuted terribly in this state that California, interestingly enough, was very different from before, because this was the state that represented the state that protected the natives. So they tried to expel them from the U.S., and then the Exclusion Chinese Act in 1882 was passed. So there was always some sense of exclusion of all of those who were not whites. Of course, that this is a country of migrants from the beginning, because in the process of colonizing the North American territory, the founding fathers, yes, historically they wanted migrants, but white migrants. Let's remember that in 1907, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, and they negotiated with the Japanese government to put a halt to immigration, because they didn't want them to be excluded and feel ashamed for being excluded in 1917. And the later laws excluded migrants because, yes, between whites, they wanted to exclude Catholics. As Gary mentioned it, it was not the fact that all whites were equal. They preferred Anglo-Saxons. And it's very interesting to remember that Mexicans were excluded on the grounds of illiteracy, but only to have the migrant workers flows into the U.S. But Mexicans were accepted just for the mere reason that it was thought that they would come back. They were considered to be doves that would fly back and forth, and that they would never be migrants. So they were expendable at some degree. Let's remember that this state has been exclusive. There were deportations during the Great Depression, the wetback operation in 54. Now, the Bracero program that were very useful for the U.S., but the Mexicans were there because 5 million Mexicans came to the U.S. and went back to Mexico. And then it's very interesting to see the 1965 Act, which is a major immigration reform that to this date guides the U.S. law. If we make a review of the debates in Congress when that act was passed, that today is considered as very progressive, because that's the act that created the basic principles of U.S. immigration, which is family reunification. In the debates, progressive was based on merits. That was to bring people on the grounds of merits. But conservative congressmen decided to use the claim of family reunification that ended up being the liberal approach, because they thought that more whites would come. And that is in the debates. And on top of that, when the Bracero program ended, the sword of Mexican immigration, well, changes the quota of immigration, 170,000 people, I correct myself, that in practice makes Mexican immigration an irregular flow, because in the Bracero program influx, on average, 450,000 people were part of the program. That was the real influx, because Asians were not part of that influx. So there was another quota, 120,000 for Asians. But in that context, there are not flow of Asian people into the U.S. So this is very important to remember this, because such a guiding principle made Mexicans undocumented right away. Not many of them. Douglas Mass, a very important sociologist in the U.S., estimates by 1985, before amnesty, only 13% on average of the Mexican influx were legal, given the situation. And let us not forget the IRCA law. Yes, it granted amnesty because there was no other chance. It brought along immigration measures that we still see and that creates a prison-like space in 96 that takes rights from migrants in terms of social liberties and legal liberties, and it creates, among other things, this mechanism that's the 187G in the Immigration Act that sets forth the possibility of collaborating with the authorities, with the local authorities, police officers, and that was a factor that enabled mass deportations during the Obama administration. I just want to remind you, because we are in Mexico, and I don't want to use more of your time, but let's remind ourselves that in Mexico, we also have an approach that protects the natives. Nations are built by design, as I said, and Mexico has not been immigration-prone country in terms of the percentage of immigrants in the Mexican population. Let's remind ourselves that during Porfirian times, Mexico also excluded Chinese workers, and they were persecuted as well. In 1926 and 74, the Mexican legislation in practice followed an exclusive policy. It was an ethno-racial policy. David Fitzgerald, for example, studies this with the non-assimilation criteria. People from the Middle East, Asians, and Jews were excluded. And even in 2008, if correct me if I'm wrong, immigration was punished, was criminalized with 10 years of prison in Mexico, and 3 million deportees that we've seen since 1989 to the date of Central Americans, and the policies that the Mexican state uses of what in the U.S. is called racial profiling. Central Americans are stopped on the grounds of how they speak and how they look, and then they are deported. And of course, the situation has worsened starting in 2015 with the contribution, well, not starting in 2015, before, with the collaboration of the Mexican state with the U.S. government. And that made it possible that by 2015, Mexico showed higher figures in deportations than the U.S. So, in spite of that, I want to say that the law of 65, on the contrary of what was expected, yes, there were flows of immigration and the flows have risen, but the biggest challenge, and it's different from other migrants, is in terms of Mexicans and Central Americans, because all of these groups, let's say the first generation, more than 50% were undocumented, and a population with such a high rate of undocumented migrants has no possibility of politically assimilating themselves in the U.S., and this is one of the topics that I study. So it is relevant to understand why this act was passed, but this has created a demographic change, and the demographic change that we see of Mexicans migrating, which did continue, I want to explain that we should remind ourselves that the amount of Mexicans that you find in the U.S. today is due to two reasons. A situation of the labor market in the U.S., they stay for longer, but it is due also to the migratory control policies in the U.S. that made people settle. It produced a caging effect. So now they can't come and go. So they preferred to have the relatives in the United States because it was more difficult and more costly to cross the border. And imagine for Central Americans the type of drama that they have to go through, because first we have Mexicans and then Central Americans migrating into the U.S. So that has broken families up. And to me, that's the biggest challenge and the most dramatical challenge for these populations that we're going to see affecting Mexico, Central America, and the U.S. And I'll talk about the change in demographics. It is very important to understand the reaction that we see towards this change because, as Gary Gersel explained in his presentation, between 1924, where the quota law was set, and until 65 for the refugees, the flows into the U.S. of migrants, of course, of non-whites were few. And this generation of baby boomers that are voters today and voted for Trump grew in a type of U.S. that they want to have, and it does not exist now. It didn't have any other color in their population, so that's the world that they want, and they feel affected by Trump. I call them nostalgics. And this change in demographics is also due to the electoral composition of the U.S., pushed by the civil rights movement that creates certain effect in the South. And this effect of this new other magnifies it. And this is reflected in the fact that after the 2016 election, there is not a single state in the South governed by Democrats. And it's very interesting to see that this change in its demographics has changed the country. It is oriented to a more liberal view, but first of all, unfortunately, the whites, as you can see in this small chart, even in the 2010 election, most of the voters have this composition, so this is one of the first obstacles. But it is also due to the fact, and I don't want to take more time, but it's linked to the institutions present in the U.S. right now. It is very interesting to see that in the last 7 elections, it hasn't been possible for Republicans to win the popular vote, only in 2004 with Bush. So in terms of popular votes, we see the change in demographics. Unfortunately, at an institutional level, this change is disenfranchised, so to speak, because Republicans wanted this change compared to Democrats, and they have a very wise strategy to control legislatures and state governments that, well, they hold a majority, and that has enabled the gerrymandering when the districts are reframed at a local level so they can set control over electoral districts, because when they don't vote for them for the lower house, and also the way it's been structured, the Senate in a different context, for example, in a different country, they responded to a different rationale, but states with enormous population like California have the same representation in California as smaller states. So this is just to explain the context why this change is not actually happening and what are the consequences of all of these. Well, yes, the change where there is no continuity, and probably part of this continuity, but it has reached presidential office, there is reluctance to change, but now it's happening at the White House as well. And, well, I just want to highlight that of all the changes that we are discussing here during the Obama administration, we have the highest level of deportations because this is how the scaffolding works. It goes beyond Obama, and Obama played with the situation because it was thought that at a certain point, if it is shown that the border was controlled, Republicans would be willing to negotiate, and in reality, that didn't happen. And the peak year in Obama was 433,000 deportees, and Obama realized the high figures, and well, he wanted to step back, and that's when we had the first DACA attempt to give the young to have a more stable situation status, and then DAPA and DACA came. But that eliminated the Safe Communities program and the 287G program. And these are the programs that have enabled deportations because locally these are the programs that allow collaboration with local police officers or another program to confirm if they are part of the FBI background lists, and that has enabled the deportation machine work as it did work with Obama. So what Obama took out, well, it's back. So what we see now is that the exclusion has been intensified of this prison-like apparatus, and we see a continuation of the liberal side of the American state that is trying to have the white race in a supremacy position, and this is why they're in power. The price to be paid, as I said, and this is the human side of it, and I just want to show this human side because I know that I've taken more of the time given to me. And we have a generation of American children and children in Central America and Mexico whose families are broken up. 500,000 children in Mexico, North American children with the double citizen, with uncertain legal status. We don't know what will happen to them. And the children that stay in the U.S. when their parents are deported, and the children in Central America and Mexico that can't see their parents because their parents can't come back to their homeland because the cost of coming back is very high. So this is a tragedy that is going to have a social cost, enormous economic cost, and in the Q&A, I can share you the results of a study where I show with a clear sample, well, not representative of 93 people that I interviewed in the Northern Triangle, the parents who brought their kids along from their hometown, the unaccompanied children that were very popular in the 2014, were apart from their parents 7.5 years. And the ones who have left children, on average, they've been apart at least 8 years so far. So that speaks about a generation that emotionally is going to grow up in trauma. Parents with clinical depression that I've interviewed, that they haven't seen their children, and I don't know how they're going to be able, both parents and children, be productive individuals in the future with this family breakup. Thank you very much.
Well, this presentation would be for another meeting, just with you as someone studying this, as a professional on this issue. And we see this in everyday life. The children and these new generations are not speaking Spanish anymore. I don't know any simpler. I know I'm saying very simple things, but you have left us with a price to pay. Because here, how to reconcile the family situation with the impossibility of having the family, the very complex situation, definitely. We're going to have to distract ourselves from our things to go to Syria. From the least of all evils, perhaps, I don't know. Well, Nick Quested is here with us. His yes, ears. Nick is executive director and proprietor of Gold Coast Fields. He's built one of the main documentary producers in the world, 2 Emmys and an Oscar nomination for his work. He has been the producer of over 35 films, but before concentrating his attention on production, he was musical video, and commercial director. His most recent project is Infierno en la Tierra, yes, Hell on Earth. This is a film for National Geographic Channel on Syria and Iraq conflict, as premiered on spring of this year. Let us look at a sample of his film, and I really enjoyed finding out that the production design of the film, the girl that you were production designer related to Oaxaca. So you've also been working on Mexican projects, right? So on Infierno en la Tierra, Hell on Earth, Nick says that we wanted to tell the story of how various protests throughout the country that started with boys doing graffiti, and they turned into mass manifestations and demonstrations, and then a civil war, which is, thank you, welcome.
Voy a hacer una táctica distinta porque creo que me voy a expresar mejor con la película. Este es un fragmento de la película de
of a Syrian family that was in ISIS-controlled territory that managed to escape. And it fits in context here because it really does humanize the refugee experience, and you can see where they face multiple walls and multiple obstacles in their journey to provide some type of security for their family. So I think that sort of just about sums it up, and we could see the clip.
When a society collapses into anarchy and violence, civilians inevitably take matters into their own hands. They have to. Their very survival is at stake.
الساعة 3:30 الفجر طيران بشار الأسد عم بضرب. وين عم بضرب حاليا مع حدا.
لا تخافي بابا، لا تخافي لا تخافي لا تخافي.
صراحة بدي أنفجر وما بحسن إني أعبر عن شعوري الداخلي. بدي أضحك غصبا عني عشان هالأطفال هي ما تخاف أو تتلبك.
اليوم رحنا على منبج وشفنا راسين زلم معلقين مع الدوارات.
اليوم؟
ايوه.
كبار؟
كبار صغار؟ شباب عمر 18 وبهالشيء. وبي واحد حاطينه بالقفص عم يعوي مثل التشل.
ليش؟
قال القفص ما ينحبس فيه غير التشل.
ايش جرمه يعني؟ عم يدخن
عم يدخن وقاضبينه.
هو جاي الدور على كل السوريين بنحطهم بالقفص وبدها تعوي وبدها.
فكان قطع الروس هو الحاله المخيفه اللي ما عم بتخلي حدا انه يحسن يحكي شيء، لانه مجرد يجوز تحكي شيء تتعلق على الساحه 3-4 ايام انت معلق، انهم بجيبوك بصدقوا. يعني مسيحي، ارمني، يهودي ما في مشكله، نحن انا هو في حاله وانا في حالي، هذا ديننا نحن، ما بصير انا اكفره واقطع راسه، انا عم بعلم اولادي انه ديننا نحن دين تسامح، يعني ما بصير انا يكون ابني متشدد، صار شيء مخيف، يعني تصور انا كنت اكون بالجامع بيجي حدا داعشي العالم بس الجامعة كلها تخاف. بجوز هذا يحكي له كلمة ينقطع راسه.
If you instill fear in a society, it comes at a big cost. I mean, you see it in our political campaigns going on today in the United States with some of the comments that are being made about various parts of our society and what to do about them. The whole issue of immigration is a big, big deal. This is where great leaders, great nations have to come together and say, this is what the world is going to end up having to do, and we're going to direct some of this.
هلا اليوم هي وصلتنا من السوق. المرأة هي مثل ما انك شايف، بابا بعد شوي خلي ماما هي لبس الشراي تبع داعش، لسه في كمان غطاء غطي عن عيونك، لانه هذا هي يعني هذا اجرام. هلا اذا عينها مبينه تشوف قدامها معلش ما بصير تشوف قدامها هيك. هي اذا كانت مرتي اذا كانت مرت الجيران ما بعرف انا. يعني اذا انا بالسوق بضيعها بجوز امسك ايدي غير مره وامشي، ما حدا بيسالني منو هي مثلا. حاطين مراكز تفتيش ممنوع حدا يعني اي سياره تجي او شخص تفتيش نزيل وين هويتك، عندك ورقه امنيه تطلع من مناطق داعش ما معك رجع. انا حاولت 3 مرات وما احسن اطلع. صرت ادور على مهرب، المهربين يعني صار شيء مخيف عندهم. الكي طلعك ب $100 صار بده $700. يعني صار مو في صرت انت تخاف، هن صار يخافوا اكثر منك. يعني مجرد انه حتى لما تجي لعنده بقول لك لا تقول انا جاي لعندي مشان اهربك، انت جاي لعندي زياره، انت صديقي فلان، انت من طرف فلان، جايني مشان غير شغله. يعني ما بصير تحكي قدام حدا. اعطيت له مهرب مصاري، ثاني نهار جيت على اساس يهربني لغايه معتقل ومشيوه لعندهم عند داعش. لحظة بدنا نروح نشوف المهرب، بلشي نقدر انه بلشي خلصنا اليوم، صار نهارين عم نروح عليه والطريق مسكر وما عم نقدر نروح. بلشي اليوم يا رب يعني الله ييسر الامر ونقدر نطلع برات البلد، لان الوضع صار كئيب جدا يعني.
على ألمانيا ولا تركيا؟
على تركيا والله. على تركيا. يا اخذنا هي شو بتاعنا. ايش يطلع بيدي؟ رحت على المهرب صار 10 مرات، كل يوم يقتل نوهون والطريق مسكر. طيب ايش اسوي؟ يقول لي بس اعطيني حل وانا موافق ما عندي مشكله.
لقينا غير هالمهرب ادفع له شوي زياده بس ياخذنا.
ايش قدران اطلع برات نفوت من الدوله الاسلاميه؟ لو يطلعوني نروح على غير المهرب، ما في غير المهرب وعن طريق الدوله الاسلاميه، ممنوع حدا يطلع من غيره.
يا شتينا هدول حتى على حدود ما يقدروا يمشون وحل وتراب
والله ما بعرف، فرج الله.
ايش فيدي على المشروع يعني
لحالي احاول بدون مهرب انه احاول اعبر عن الحدود التركيه، بلكي انه الله ييسر امري واحسن اطلع، لانه الوضع هون صار جحيم جحيم جدا جدا. يعني العيشه ضمن الارض الدوله الاسلاميه مستحيله. لما وصلت السيارة عند الحاجز أنا يعني بحالة رعب. هي مرتي صارت ترجف، صرت أقرأ آيات قرآنية أدعي.
There shouldn't be, through the use of half-truth and manipulation, an assumption that everyone who's a Muslim is a terrorist or a criminal, which is what in some quarters is the impression given. We want to see that when people are forced out of their homes because of conflict, that they find a safe space and they're not abused and they're made to suffer further.
لما طلعنا الهلال والفرحة لا توصف. صدقني ولدت من جديد.
اللي عدينا فيه اليوم 3 حدود 4 حدود. حدود الدولة الإسلامية، حدود الجيش الحر، والحدود التركية، وهلا نحن صرنا بكلس. خلص صفيت حر اني اربي دقني او ما اربي دقني. ايش بده يكون احساسي؟ ماني مجبر على الاسلام غصبا عني يعني. وما علامه للاسلام الدقن يعني.
سنة شو علامة؟ حبيت انت تسن فيها؟
اليهود مربينكم
طبعا ما هي فرض.
ما هي لا.
The summer of 2015, suddenly hundreds of thousands of people came, Syrian refugees from Turkey. A lot of people also feel overwhelmed by what they see as what they perceive as an invasion of Muslims threatening our way of life. This has caused an enormous political backlash. In Holland we have Wilders, who wants to outlaw Islam completely. In France we have Le Pen. She wants to close the country for immigrants and wants to expel every criminal immigrant, which is already happening, by the way, in the US.
The resources that are going to be required to correct some of these problems that we have, refugees, displaced people around the world, the numbers are staggering. We have to get back in there, stabilize that area to the point where you can then tell all these people who would rather live in their own homes, you can tell them to all come back. Otherwise, the likelihood of a far greater conflict grows higher and higher every day.
والله أنا شيء معرف ابن حلال العاصي.
والله صار تلاقي ابن حلال معرف ابن حلال هي
وعم تاجر بالبشرات.
بس ما يكون
ابن حلال.
موتنا بالبحر. مشكلة.
بدك تدور لنا حدا بالمطاعم على هذول الشباب سوريين نسالهم على يسالوا مين وين بمهربين. السلام عليكم.
ناس تقول لك يعني ناس انا ما اريد اكذب عليك واقول لك انا لانه اخوي واختي يا واش ترى الحين تسوي والله العظيم دحر يعني انا اخوي.
This is the biggest registration center and transit camp in Greece. We welcome a lot of people that are coming from the boats, wet, trembling. Sometimes you see the color in their hand is blue. We even have children who are not breathing. We take care of these people, give them clean clothes, we give them medical support. The Turkish smugglers promise these people that they will be in a small boat with just 10 or 15 people. The boats are sinking because they're 5 times overloaded. If they were simply putting the normal number of people, even on their shitty boats, they would still make it to Greece. They don't even give them a life vest. They give them fake life vests that keeps drowning people because of the weight.
Any reasonable person would flee the kind of fighting that we've seen in Syria. They'd happily risk their lives to be smuggled across the border. They'd collect by the millions in neighboring countries, even living in squalid refugee camps. Eventually, they'd make their way to the West to look for a better life for their children. People say, look, it's not our problem. Okay, it's not your problem, but that doesn't mean you won't be affected by it. You can say that you don't actually care about human suffering, but the truth is that all violence and misery eventually affect the entire world. In that sense, there is no escaping the fact that we are all part of the human race. There is no escaping the fact that borders become irrelevant once people start dying and societies begin to collapse.
إن شاء الله ساعة أقل من ساعة.
خليها يا شباب قولوا هذاك هذيك الجبال شايف هذيك الجبال هذيك اليونان بس لا أحد يفكر هيك.
family were subsequently stopped by the Turkish Coast Guard on the day of the Turkish-EU treaty ratification, where the European Union paid $4 billion a year for Erdogan to close his borders to anyone traveling north. So any Syrians trying to get to Europe at that point were stopped and returned to Turkey. They haven't been repatriated to Syria at this point because, to a certain extent, they are a great voting tool for Erdogan, and he has a very slim majority that he engineers for his own political gain. The family were taken to a detention center. So imagine 3,000 Syrians in a high school gym where they each got one blanket per family and maybe one meal a day if they were lucky, or when journalists turned up. They spent 10 days in that, and then they managed to return to Izmir, where Marwan has managed to buy a car and runs a small taxi service. And Radwan and the family, they run a small shop selling small Syrian things to the large Syrian population that is there. Despite Erdogan's political use of the refugees, Turkey does and continues to do an amazing job to feed and support a huge immigrant population that is over 2 million people. So it's a complicated situation, to say the least. You also can look at Jordan. Jordan houses over 1.5 million Syrians on its northern border. In Mosul alone, 400,000 people were moved in the space of a month and are being housed in a series of camps around Erbil, which is another tragedy. So.
There are some previews of this film. One is interesting, Chronic of the Descent of Syria to Absolute Chaos and the Search of ISIS. This is a passionate and very bold analysis of this butchery and this, what is even more important, the human tragedy. Nick Quested and his colleagues are looking at the entrails of all this, and this is a documentary edited. It is about 1,000 hours of filming and the histories of survival and tragedy for a family in their attempt to flee from Syria. They take us inside the war with Kurd fighters and Shiite militia, and also others that are in Al-Qaeda in Aleppo and Raqqa, with comments and valuations of some of the best experts of politics throughout the world. And together with images, they all give us an idea of the development of events in this cruel war day by day. We saw an example of this. Thank you so much, Nick. What an excellent decision to have created this panel and diverse voices, and to have you as well here, Nick. The subject matter is narrative and testimonials of migration. Do we have any cards with questions? Anyone? Comments, please, from the audience, or just out loud? Directly ask your question with a microphone so that we can interpret it, of course. Yes, the card. Let's see. Yes. Thank you. I think that the main siege against the civilization right now, or siege on civilization, is this ideology that is becoming stronger now. Naturalism, telling us that the self doesn't exist, free agency doesn't exist, merit and demerit don't exist, ethics don't exist, and this is increasingly stronger. And here we have this book on neurosciences, and for me, this is the main siege against humankind. It dehumanizes us, and it's on paper, it's annihilated us. So it's important to know what is happening. And this means that we're going to be treated in a Darwinian mode. They're going to exterminate us through hunger, or let us kill each other and build a wall and let each other kill. This is going to be natural selection if we start killing each other, dehumanization. So this is another front where we have to take into account. But there are tools in our traditions, the spiritual millenary legacy, heritage, that may help us to avoid this catastrophe.
Well, you have the floor. Are there more questions? Please be brief. Well, I've watched the documentary the day it was showed here, so my question is, because obviously I value all the footing showed in the documentary, but my question is, most of the wars have been funded by the U.S., as it happened in World War II. I think the microphone died. Well, it's working. So how, in this documentary, obviously all wars are sensationalist, but it is shown the good side of what the U.S. is doing. But I would like to know, what is the influence of the U.S. by sending tanks, weapons, and funding the war in itself and the context in general? I would like to understand, because there are two sides of this story. I mean, the support given to Bashar al-Assad and the other side that the documentary shows. So that's basically my question.
To me.
Yeah.
The American support of the war in Syria was both overt and covert. Overtly, they had a congressional finding to support the rebels, and then they had a program called Train and Equip. But in the context of the support given to the Free Syrian Army and the rebels, I think it would be maybe it would be a very small proportion compared to the Gulf state support of the various FSA factions and the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is basically al-Qaeda in Iraq. America in Syria pursued a low intervention policy in comparison to their policy in Libya, which was a no-fly zone, overt support both financially and militarily for the rebels, which resulted in the assassination by the rebels of Gaddafi and a failed state. So their policy in both situations has led to a failed state. So I don't know if you can blame this war entirely on the Americans. I think that the other proxy players of Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia saw that small spark and said, this is our opportunity to use this hope of the Arab Spring to unseat Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'athist Party and the kleptocracy that was the Syrian Arab regime for the last 40 years since Hafez crushed the Muslim Brotherhood uprising in the 70s. So I can't solely lay the blame of this war on the Americans.
Les vamos a agradecer al público.
We want to thank the audience for your permanence here, your participation, everything we feel. I think we could reverse this formula or change it how each one of us, we could change things with everything we do. I want to thank the National University of Mexico, the University of Guadalajara. Next week, we're going to be concluding these panels with other speakers. I want to thank everyone. Everyone, thank you so much, Nick, and everyone else. A round of applause for all of us here, the audience included. Good afternoon.
Los esperamos mañana en esta misma sala, en el panel sobre el acoso al periodismo, en donde tendremos la participación de Diego Enrique Osorno, Anabel Hernández y Guillermo Osorno. En la tarde continuamos, es a las 12 del día, y en la tarde continuaremos a las 5 hablando sobre arte y cultura como formas de resistencia. Los esperamos en esta misma sala. A las 5 es la última.